Round one of the NFL draft is Thursday night. The Lions own the third overall pick. What will they do? To help answer that question, we call on Nick Baumgardner from The Athletic. Nick, let's pretend Martha Ford just fired Bob Quinn and made you the general manager. What are you doing at 3?
Well, I'm probably contemplating a lot of things if that actually happens. But if that actually happened, I think that the obvious situation for Detroit, which is easier said than done, is to move the pick, move back, and add extra assets. If you go through the whole thing and look at, what possibly adding another pick in the 40s, let's say early in the second round would do. I mean, that would give the Lions 5 picks, inside the top 85. That would give them 3 what I would consider premium players. If you can get 3 players in the top 40, I think that's premium talent in a draft that's pretty good and pretty deep. And, the Lions are set up here if they can move that pick to possibly, upgrade their roster in more than just a handful of areas in a way that we would see sooner than later, if that makes sense. They're in a really good position here, not one that anyone envies because that means you're also, struggling on the field. But when you have that number 3 pick like that, it is coveted. It's easier said than done to move it back. A lot of things have to happen for you, but that's got to be number 1 on the list, is to be able to move back, not far enough to where you can't get some of the guys that you want, but also to upgrade your roster in general.
All right, you're a writer again. Quinn's back in the GM seat. And at his news conference on Friday, he said he's willing to trade back, would like to trade back, but won't go so far back that he can't get the impact player he covets. How far down do you think he'd be willing to trade? Where's that line he won't cross?
Yeah, I think if those impact players are Jeff Okudah, Isaiah Simmons, and or Derek Brown, then it's probably not past 7. I would say maybe 8, but I think I'd start to get uncomfortable at that point. Miami and the Chargers still seem like the 2 most obvious candidates to move that pick in the first round and still end up with, a pretty good return. If you moved down lower than that, you're going to miss out on, a guy like Okudah for sure, who's possibly, he's in the conversation with Brown and Chase Young as, the best defenders in this draft. Those guys are not going to be there, certainly beyond the top 10. And it would be a stretch, I think, to safely assume either would be there or any of the 3 would be there past 7. I assume that would be the number. He didn't say that number. We talked to him last week, so it could be lower, but I would assume right there.
Yeah, Quinn's done a solid job of adding talent, good talent in the later rounds. Who are some of the guys that you think the Lions could grab in this draft? Guys that maybe have your eye and make you think they could be diamonds in the rough?
Yeah, a couple of local products actually sort of fit what they need. If we're talking, overall, Ben Bredesen and Josiah Scott are 2 players from Michigan State. Bredesen, of course, the offensive lineman for Michigan. Josiah Scott's a corner for Michigan State. I think both those guys are going to be there on day 3, possibly. And both those guys would fit a need. Both those guys, the Lions are familiar with because, they played here. I think that when we look at the draft this year and say, okay, these teams didn't have pro days, they didn't have, the extra workouts, they didn't have the extra meetings with people in person. We could see teams start to default a little bit more in some of those situations with guys they know more about. Those are 2 local prospects who are both, really good players that should be there on day 3, that should be able to compete for time quickly. Guys that would fit a need in Detroit as well. And then you go across the list. There's a bunch of guys like that, but 2 local ones that would jump off the top. I think that would both have fits conceivably, depending on how the board shakes out, for Detroit on day 3.
Nick, you cover Michigan and Michigan State for The Athletic. You just mentioned a couple of those products, but we know Cesar Ruiz is likely one of the top centers in the draft, expected to go first or early second round. Where do you see Josh Uche going?
Yeah, I think Uche has predictably – he did very well for himself at the Senior Bowl, and I actually think, in some ways, there's so much limited tape on him. In some ways, maybe not having a pro day probably helped him because he got everything he needed done at the Senior Bowl and the Combine. He ran well, he tested well, he performed well on tape. He's terrific off the edge. He is the type of prospect I think that, a patient coaching staff, a patient franchise is going to have to invest in, but if it's the right one, I could absolutely see him going in the second round. I think he's inched up. I think some people have even slotted him late first round based on, their sort of read on him as a player in general. I think he's certainly one of the top 50 players in the draft in terms of athleticism and what he can do. But again, it would take a patient staff and I would also say probably a creative staff because he's a hybrid. He is not a standard edge player in what we consider, that to be in the NFL right now. He's also not a player with much experience, as an off-ball linebacker. So it would take some time and it would take some patience, similar to what it would be with a player like Isaiah Simmons at the top of the draft. But I think Uche, in the world we live in now in the NFL with hybrids on the front and back end, would absolutely qualify as a guy to watch, there on day 2.
What other Wolverines could hear their names called?
Yeah, a lot actually. Ruiz and Uche you just mentioned. Josh Metellus actually I think has got more buzz on the back end. As a day 3 pick possibly. We mentioned Bredesen. You go down the list there in the top 300. Dane Brugler at the Athletic just did his top 300. I think he's got 9 Michigan players in his top grouping there. Lavert Hill could be a day 3 situation for someone. Sean McCune could be a day 3 pick for a tight end spot if somebody sort of likes his game tape. All the guys that went to the combine for Michigan and Michigan State really, I think that the only ones that I would look at and say I think would have a tougher time sneaking in. I'm not sure about Shea Patterson. I'm not sure about Khaleke Hudson. I'm not sure about Michael Dana, but the rest of them, that were at the combine that got invited, Mike and Wayne, John Runyon. All those offensive line. I think Michigan could have 4 offensive linemen taken. I think Kenny Willekes from Michigan State's another guy that could end up hearing his name called earlier as well. Raekwon Williams would be another one. I think Raekwon didn't get a lot of buzz, but I think he's a guy that's certainly draftable. I would be a little surprised if he doesn't hear his name called as well.
Yeah, how early do you think you could hear Willekes, all Big Ten performer?
Yeah.
How early do you think he could go? How late can he slide?
It would take somebody that really fell in love with him to take him on day 2, because I think he's certainly going to be there on day 3. I think Willekes is the guy that I look at and say you watch enough of his tape and you can see how bendable and flexible and sort of relentless he is off the edge, but he's never really ever had to drop and cover. I'm not sure how fast he is in space, but I think I look at Willekes and say, we're going to be. Whenever we go back to actual football, and if they actually go back to a training camp situation, Willekes is the guy that's going to go into a camp and just annoy starters ahead of him enough to where he wins a job. I mean, that's just what he's going to do. He's the example of a player in this draft that you really don't want to bet against. So I think he's going to hear his name called somewhere on day 3. I don't know where exactly. I'd be surprised if it's before that. But again, if a team really likes him and just falls in love with everything that he has, and they have a role for him, then I could see it going earlier. But I'd be surprised if he's not drafted, but I would think probably on day 3.
Last thing for you, Nick, how badly does Bob Quinn need to ace this draft?
Yeah, it's got to happen. I mean, it's one of those things where, you've got to be sure, and that's the case for every draft, of course, but, there can't be any, reaches for the sake of, let's take a shot here and see what happens. I mean, everything's got to go. And really more than that, I think we've got to be able to see where that talent upgrade, sort of exists within their roster when they get back on the field. I mean, you've got to be able to see it. They've got to be able to get production, from more than just 1 or 2 players, kind of, right? It's got to be, if you're drafting 7 or 8 guys that you expect to be, contributors sooner than later, we got to see it. So, I think it's a very interesting situation because you're drafting for the present day. You're trying to get yourself better, trying to meet whatever we want to call it, whether or not it's an ultimatum or not to make the playoffs. I don't know, what specifically was said in that room that day, but I don't think it was an ultimatum in exact terms. But at the same time, they want a competitor. They want a team that's going to contend, deep into the fall, into November and December. And if you're going to be able to do that, you have to be able to add talent right now in this draft. And again, like you said earlier, they've got a situation here where if they hit this right, they could walk out of here with many, I would say, high level players, more than just 1 or 2. I think you could be looking at with the picks they have in the 3rd, maybe 5 guys if they hit it right, who could help this team on day 1, whenever that is, when next season begins.